1, 2.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's Puppet Fuss. Miss Janine here. And today I have one of my favorite stories called Bark George by Jules Pfeffer. It starts like this. George's mother said, "Bark, George." So George stood up straight and tall, looked at his mother, and said, "Quack, quack, quack." And his mother said, "No, George, that's not how dogs bark. Dogs say, woof." Okay, no more silliness. Come on, George, bark, George. George looked at his mother, stood up even taller, and this time he said, "Meow." "No, George, that's not how dogs bark. That's how cats bark. Dogs say, woof." Okay, no more silliness, George. Bark, George. George shook his ears, shook his tail, and said, "Oink, oink, oink." "No, George," said his mother, "that is not how dogs bark. That's how pigs bark. Dogs say, woof." By now, Mother Dog was beginning to get a little worried, so she said, "Come on, George, you can do this." George stood up as tall as he could. He looked at his mother and he said, "Moo." "No, George," said his mother, "that's not how dogs bark. That's how cows bark. I think we bet to take you to the veterinarian." And so George's mom took George to the veterinarian. When they got to the veterinarian looked George all over, looked in his ears, looked in his eyes, looked in his nose, and he said, "Why, Mrs. Dog, you have a fine young pup here. What seems to be the problem?" And Mrs. Dog said, "Well, you see, doctor, it's when he barks." "Really?" said the doctor. "Well, now, Georgie boy, give me a good bark here." George looked at the doctor, looked at his mom, and he said, "Quack, quack, quack." And the doctor said, "Why, this is most unusual. But don't worry, Mrs. Dog, we will get to the bottom of this." So he pulled his gloves up just beyond his wrist, said, "Open wide, George." George opened his mouth wide, and the doctor reached down deep, 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 deep inside, and he pulled, and he tugged, and he pulled, and out came a duck. "There now," said the doctor. "That's a good boy. That should take care of that. All right, Georgie boy, give me a good bark here. Bark, George." George looked at his mother, looked at the vet, looked back at his mother and said, "Meow." "My, this is indeed a strange case," said the vet. He pulled the gloves all the way up to his elbow, said, "Open wide, George." George opened his mouth wide. The veterinarian reached down deep, 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 deep down inside, and he pulled, and he tugged, and he pulled, and he tugged, and he pulled, and he tugged, and out came a cat. "There now, Mrs. Dog. That should surely take care of that. All right, bark, George." Once again, George looked at the vet, looked at his mother, looked back at the vet, looked back at his mother, and he said, "Oink, oink, oink." "Oh, no," said the veterinarian. We'll take care of this, Mrs. Dog. Now, don't you go worrying." And he pulled the gloves all the way up to his biceps, to his muscles, and he said, "Open wide, George." George opened his mouth wide. The veterinarian reached down deep, 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 deep down inside of George, and he pulled, and he tugged, 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 and he pulled out a pig. "Oh, my goodness, I think we got this now, Mrs. Dog. All right, here we go. Bark, George." George looked at the vet, looked at his mom, looked at the vet, looked at his mom, looked at the vet, looked at his mom, and then George said, "Moo." "Oh, no," said the veterinarian. "Don't worry, Mrs. Dog. George, open wide." So George opened his mouth wide, and the veterinarian reached down deep, 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 deep down inside. And then he pulled and he dug and he pulled and he tugged and he pulled and he tugged. He pulled, he tugged so hard his face got all red. And he kept pulling and tugging and finally, out came a cow. All right. I think we got it now, Mrs. Dog. All right, let me just catch my breath. Okay. Bark, George. George looked at the vet, looked at his mom, looked at the vet, looked at his mom, looked back and forth for a little while. And then finally, George stood up straight and tall, and George said, woof, 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 woof. He barked, said Mrs. Dog. Mrs. Dog was so excited. She gave the cow a kiss. She gave the pig a kiss. She gave the cat a kiss. Well, cat didn't like it. She gave the duck a kiss. And then she gave the veterinarian kisses all over his face. She went kiss, 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 kiss. And then Mrs. Dog headed back home. But on the way home, she was so excited. She wanted to show George off to everyone on the street. So she said, bark, George. And George went, hello. And that's the end of this silly story. I hope you liked it. Well, if you'd like to read the story Bark, George for yourself, it's available at the library through curbside pickup. You can pick up Bark, George and lots of other books Monday through Friday at the library. Bye, everybody.